Here we have our basic mirepoix and seasoning ingredients for a roasted chicken soup. Alright, so we're going to be working on a roasted chicken soup, and we're going to be first beginning with these knife cuts for that. The knife cuts are going to be, we're going to attack the knife cuts differently than we did with the mirepoix because we want them to be more precise. While obviously the larger the cut, the more rustic and less precise this dish is going to look. We always want to be conscious of making sure that with a soup that you have the ingredients small enough to fit into a spoon so that someone can eat it easily. The more careful you are with the knife cuts, the more refined and ultimately the better looking your soup is going to be. So it's important to take your time with these knife cuts. First, I'm going to start with the onion. I left the peel intact because I wanted to show you that you really do have to attack it entirely differently. Rather than with mirepoix where we just clip off both ends, I'm just going to clip off this tail end and leave this root intact. So my first cut again is just going to be to clip that tail end off. Take that tail end, place it into my scrap bowl. Next, I'm going to be cutting directly through that root end. Now, instead of having something round that's rolling around on my cutting board, I have two flat pieces that I'm going to be able to attack. It's much easier to attack something that has a nice flat surface. First, take the peels off of both of these guys. Next, I'm going to be doing a series of horizontal and vertical cuts if you're trying to get a nice precise small dice. With a small dice, I want to make sure that those horizontal and vertical cuts are really close to one another. The further apart those cuts get, the larger the dice will become. I like to make sure that I put my hand on top of the onion and I'm really using the ball of my hand to make sure that the onion isn't sliding around. And I'm going to do my first horizontal cut. I am making sure that it's not going all the way through, but going as close to that root end as possible without going through. Another. And if you do go through, it's not the end of the world. Just place it right back on top. That's why you want to make sure that your palm is nice and flat. If I were holding it like that and slid through, that could have been real dangerous. Okay. Next, the vertical cuts. So you can see there's natural lines in this onion, and I kind of want to follow those natural lines as I'm doing these vertical cuts. You can see the darker green. Oop. Okay. It's okay if one little piece falls off, just push him to the side and you can attack him later. Now going back through, getting a nice small dice. This little piece that fell off, and just knife go right through him. Okay. Next, the other half. Horizontal cuts first. Now the vertical cuts. Trying to make sure that I'm not going all the way through the root. Definitely makes it a lot easier if you don't. Stays nice and tacked. And then through again. That nice small dice. Once I get towards the end, I like to knock it onto its side. Oops. It's much easier to attack it on that flat side rather than that really narrow flat side. And then any places that still need some more cutting, slide your knife right through. Okay. A nice small dice there. Should have done this in a bowl. Continuing on with our knife cuts, we're going to go to a small dice of celery. I've already trimmed the celery, so just remember back to your knife cuts for stock, trimming off the top and the bottom to make sure that you have a nice even piece. My first step when I'm doing any kind of small dice with something like a carrot or celery is to take my larger pieces and to cut them down into shorter ones. Just easier to attack things that are just slightly shorter. I'm not doing like a perfect small dice. This is a small dice for a soup. And so if I were doing something more precise, I might be more likely to like square the ends off, but I don't want to waste any of this. So I'm just going to take those smaller pieces and cut them into batons. Take each one, cut it in half. It's a slightly larger piece because sometimes celery does get more large and tapered at one end, larger at the other. You can cut it into, say, 3 or 4 pieces or just in half. Use your best judgment. You want the pieces to be even, uniform, so that they'll cook at the same rate. Also want to make sure always small enough to fit on a spoon. Okay. Keeping your fingers nice and curled, keep them protected. Knife straight up and down. Could do a piece at a time, but really part of the idea of learning to cook is also learning to be efficient. And so lining these guys up side by side makes it a little bit easier, a little bit quicker, more efficient. Don't rush. Make sure you take your time. Okay. Making sure we're peeling the outside completely, trimming the top and the bottom, and then taking it, cutting it down into shorter pieces. If it's a nice long carrot like this one, cut it into thirds. And depending, again, on the size of the carrot, because this one is rather narrow, I'm just going to cut it in half. Now I have 2 flat sides, and then cutting that half in half. This one I'm going to go into thirds because it's getting slightly larger. Same goes for this one. Strips first, then cut those strips into a dice. As the carrot gets slightly larger, you can square it off a little bit more. Then it's easier to kind of get that more precise dice. If they were really large carrots, then it's really easy to square it off. But just because you're squaring it off doesn't mean that you shouldn't use those rounded ends in something like a soup. They're super useful. If you get something that's really, really thin, you're going to have too small of a piece, then why not throw it into your stock pot? I shouldn't have much trim. Anything that's left over, any trim, take it. If you have a stock pot going, put it in a stock pot. If you don't have a stock pot going, save it for one. I want to add some tomato to this chicken soup. That's going to add a nice complex flavor. The more we cook this tomato down, the more flavor it's going to add, more umami it will add. I'm going to add them a little bit later in the game. I kind of want to keep them in larger pieces. I want them to be showcased. I'm also going to do a tomato concasse, a classic French technique with a different variety of tomato. These are a small vine-ripened cherry tomato. I'm going to be doing a concasse with aroma tomato. You could tomato concasse any tomato. That term just refers to blanching a tomato, shocking it, taking the peel off, deseeding, and small dicing. These are just really pretty, and so we want to showcase them. I'm going to do a chiffonade of parsley. You hear this term chiffonade, and it's a French term that refers to cutting usually some sort of green vegetable or herb into ribbons or strips. More often than not, you hear it with mint or basil, and they're pretty easy to kind of figure out how to chiffonade because they're a big leaf that's easy to fold on itself. With parsley, it's a little bit more tricky, but the concept is really the same, a big leaf that you're folding on itself. So I like to keep a nice big tuft together like this. I don't mind if there's stems, but I want to make sure that all of my parsley is kind of lined up the same way and facing the same way and lying flat. And then I'm going to take it and just kind of roll it on itself. And the better and tighter I can get it, the more thin a chiffonade I'll be able to get. It's a little bit different technique than just finely chopped parsley. And don't think that it doesn't affect the flavor. It does. Tearing parsley versus pounding it in mortar and pestle versus chiffonade versus chopped are all very different flavors. As I get close to the stems, as long as I'm getting nice and fine, that's going to be absolutely perfect in my soup. There's a lot of flavor in those stems. Don't be put off by them. I have some scrap end. What I'm going to do is just, again, save it for your stock. Put it in my stock pot. All right, I'm going to do a little bit of thyme. This thyme is pretty woody. Just meaning that it's old enough and has been, is strong enough where the stems are really woody. Sometimes it's just a little bit more tender depending on the varietal. And so because it is so woody, I am definitely going to make sure to take that extra step to pull the thyme off of the stem. I can take those stems and throw them into my stock pot or save them for a future stock pot. When you're taking the leaves off of a stem, when it comes to something like rosemary or thyme, like this one, you want to pull in the opposite direction that the leaves are going in. So the leaves are pointing in this direction, and so I'm going to pull in the opposite direction. And that they come off pretty easily, and more often than not, it's not going to like tear. Instead of, if you pull the opposite way, it's very likely that the leaves and the stem will come kind of pulling off in just little pieces, and it's just, kind of defeating the purpose. This might seem like it's a lot of work and maybe not worth the effort. It is worth the effort. Any amount of fresh herbs that you're going to add to anything, especially something like a soup or a stew or a sauce, is really going to make all the difference, especially the fresh. There's something very easy about using fresh thyme there's something very easy about using dried thyme, but the flavor, in my opinion, is just not there. And if you've never tried fresh thyme before, strongly encourage you to. Take these stems, throw them into my stock pot. Now I'm ready to chop. There are some little fine stems towards the end, as long as I'm real thorough with chopping. But I want to make sure that I'm evenly chopping. My knife is nice and sharp. It's not bruising it. It's just chopping it up, bringing out those oils. Next, I'm just gonna, I like to keep my basil whole a lot or tear it off. More often than not, I'm not gonna touch basil with a knife. That's just my personal opinion on basil. Chefs will differ on those opinions, and I'm not going to say what's right and what's wrong. But for this application, what we're going to do is just tear the basil. I am going to take this basil stalk and put it into my stock pot. It's going to certainly take this stock in a different direction because basil is going to be one of those flavors that kind of is different than like a basic flavor like a parsley stem. Or a thyme stem. They're both kind of more foundational flavors, whereas basil takes it in a certain Mediterranean direction and sometimes other directions. But it's not going to be an off-putting flavor, so I'm not unhappy about adding it to this stock pot. I'd rather not waste it. My next step is going to be to just simply tear these basil leaves. Some of them I might even leave whole. If it's like a piece like that, I might pull the stem off a little bit more, but I like to use basil almost like a vegetable. sometimes I'll choose in a pot of soup like this, I could even put 5 times this amount of basil into the soup and I'd be perfectly happy, almost treating it like a spinach and wilting it in. Okay. And lastly, just gonna do a really simple mince of garlic. I personally like to kind of attack garlic the same way I do an onion. You could just as easily run your knife back and forth through it, but I kind of like to have a little bit more control than that. Controls the mess. Garlic can be really sticky and gross, and therefore difficult to handle. And so if you kind of keep it intact, it's a little bit easier. I'm gonna have to run my knife through it again several times, but it's just a lot more controlled that way. Horizontal and vertical cuts just to get that initial dice, small dice. I guess not a brunoise because it's not precise enough to be a brunoise, but you're aiming for that in size, and then aiming for much smaller because that's what a mince is. Very, very fine pieces. Be working on a tomato concasse. First, I'm going to cut this core out of the tomato. I'm just going to use my paring knife, just the tip of it. Next, I'm going to cut just a little X on the opposite end of where the core was. That little X, I'm not really looking to cut into the flesh too deeply, really. What I'm just trying to do is cut a nice little seam for the skins to begin to pull away after I've blanched these tomatoes. So with the tomato concasse, the idea is that we're going to be taking the peels off, taking the seeds out, and then doing a small dice. And in order to get those peels off, that's our little place to start kind of peeling the peels back. And after we submerge these in boiling water, we're going to start to see it pucker at us. Okay, so I have a nice pot that has enough water so that these tomatoes will completely submerge, and this water is a nice rolling boil. It's important for it to be at a boil. Dropping my tomatoes right into it. Depending on how ripe these tomatoes are is going to determine how long they need to be in the water. Tomato concasse can take anywhere from 10 to 20 seconds, maybe even longer if it's a very underripe tomato. These are rather ripe, at least dark in color. Wouldn't necessarily say they were ripe because of the time of year. This might take a little bit longer than 10 seconds, but you're really just looking to see the skins kind of start to pucker. Sometimes you'll even see a tear in the side of the tomato, the skin. What you don't want is for them to cook so much that the flesh starts to cook as well. You're not trying to cook the tomato itself, just trying to get the skins to release. And so once you start to see this tearing starting to happen, now I know that I'm ready to take this tomato out. I'm going to place this over here. I do have my ice bath prepared already. Looks like this one might need just a little bit longer. I have my ice bath, which is just some ice and some water. I'm going to submerge my tomatoes in this ice bath, and this is going to be the shocking process. Shocking means I'm stopping that cooking process completely. This guy's definitely done by now. Into water. Okay. Gonna spend enough time in this water for them cool down enough so that the cooking process is stopped. So if they're still warm, you want to keep them in that water. If they're going to carry over cook, that cooking is going to continue if they stay nice and warm. And we're going to cook them longer. We want these tomatoes to hold their shape. Sometimes rolling them around in the water helps. Okay, at the point where I can peel the skins off. Probably could have cooked a little bit longer actually. Nope, there we go. Okay. Okay, nicely peeled. My next step is actually going to be to get the seeds out. So I'm going to cut them in half. And then usually you can just use your finger to kind of knock these seeds out. This is not something that I would put into a stock pot. Make sure that you're knocking all the seeds out. The idea with the concassé is that there's not a single seed. So even one seed really is not a proper concassé. And technically I could get in there and cut that inner membrane out, but I find that's really wasteful, which is why I prefer to just dig my finger in and pull the seeds out. I could cut this whole inner membrane out, and some chefs do choose to do that. I just find it to be rather wasteful, so I don't do it. I'd rather get my hands in there, just get those little seeds out with my fingers, and then cut that inner membrane up into a small dice. Take a look at my tomatoes, make sure I didn't miss any seeds. I can see a couple that I am going to pull out after I clean up my board. Next, because we're doing a small dice, we're just following that same principle, cutting into strips first, then a dice, depending on how small we want. Put the strips a little bit closer together, make them a little smaller. I want to stay generally about the same size as the small dice for the rest of the mirepoix, because this is going into our chicken soup. If we wanted something a little more refined, we could go a little smaller. Doesn't have to be perfect. It's going to break down quite a lot once it gets into our broth. So you just want it to be uniform in shape, all the same size, as close to it as possible. If you see some seeds, knock them out. There's lots of little nooks and crannies, and they can hide in there. We're now going to prepare the chicken component of our chicken noodle soup. We have a chicken breast, and we're going to poach this chicken breast, but I'm going to do some stuff to it first to make it so that it will poach more evenly and just make it easier for us. If the chicken tender is still intact, you can just kind of see there's a natural seam where it will pull off. And we have that chicken tender. I'm just going to keep that whole. And then this one's pretty thin, and so I'm going to cut it in half. I know this is about the same thickness as this chicken tender, and so I don't want to cut it into too small pieces, and I have to be conscious of how many pieces I do cut it in because I'm going to end up poaching it in our soup. And so I'm going to have to fish out those pieces. And so because this thick end is slightly thicker, I am going to cut it in half horizontally. And then I'm just going to keep, because this piece is relatively thin, rather than cut it in half because it is so thin here, I'm just going to keep this piece whole, keep this piece. I'll cut that one in half. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces of chicken. I'm going to place 6 pieces of chicken into my broth and poach them later on. Set them aside for now. Okay, so we're ready to put together our soup. We have all of our mise en place in place. I have some of this reserved chicken fat that I just kept from the roasted chicken pieces, and I'm just gonna use that as some of the mirepoix for this soup. Start my pan nice and hot, but I don't want it to get so hot that I'm really adding too much caramelization to this. I want to try and preserve the colors of the mirepoix. So the sweat is going to be slightly different for a soup if you want to try and keep those nice flavors. So I'm going to get these ingredients into the pan with a little bit of that chicken fat. I'm going to add a small amount of olive oil as well. And then I'm going to cover the pan and sweat the ingredients down. And reserve these tomato concassé for a few more minutes. A little bit of olive oil. And a little bit of that chopped thyme. Just a touch more fat because mirepoix really does soak that fat right up. You don't want so much that it's swimming in fat, but you don't want the mirepoix to look dry at all. A pinch of salt, because I like to kind of season from the bottom up when it comes to soups. Season in stages. I'm not seasoning for final seasoning, just a little pinch. Putting the lid on it, keeping that heat on medium. And I'll be checking it in a couple minutes, giving it a stir. But what I'm looking for is just to get these vegetables cooked through. All right, we're at the point where we're ready to add some aromatics, which are going to change the direction of this dish for sure. Definitely take it from a very straightforward chicken soup and just kind of change the direction. So our mirepoix's been sweating down. A little bit of caramelization, which is okay. Not necessarily the goal. Adding garlic. And I like it spicy, so I'm going to put a generous pinch of red pepper flake, maybe a little bit more. Stir that up just to give it a nice initial toast before I add any liquid ingredients. I'm also going to add a little bit of dried oregano. Some Mediterranean flavors going on in here now. Next, our tomato concassé, peeled, seeded, small diced tomato. Let's see, a little bit of leftover garlic. I don't want to waste any of it. Now at the point where we can add chicken stock. Can always add more, so I always like to add, maybe a little less than what I think I might need. Give it a stir to check the consistency, and then I can add more if I want. I'm going to keep it as is for now. At that point where I'm ready to take my cut chicken breast and drop it into my broth. bring that broth up to a simmer and then turn the heat down relatively low. We don't want to see any bubbles. We just want to poach this chicken. Once the chicken is fully cooked, it's going to take us, because it's going to take probably about 5 to 6 minutes to poach. I have to keep checking. I'm just looking for it to be very firm and to register at 155 degrees Fahrenheit. Chicken's fully cooked at 165 degrees, and it will carry over cook. It will continue to cook as it comes out of that poaching liquid. I'll have just a plate ready for it, prepared on the side when I'm ready to pull that chicken out. And at that point, we'll decide if we need to add more liquid. Okay, so the chicken is poached. What you're looking for, again, is 155 degrees internal temperature, but you should probably be trying to hone those instincts without using stuff like a thermometer. And what you're looking for is just a firmness to the touch. There's not going to be any there's going to be some pushback. There's not going to be this spongy kind of quality that undercooked chicken has. And if when you start to pull it, it looks a little pink, you can just drop it right back into the broth. Usually when things are cooking in a broth, you want them to kind of rest for a little bit before you start pulling them apart. But because this is going directly back into the broth, remember, you want your pieces small enough to fit on a spoon, so if pulling it isn't pulling it in small enough, you can run your knife through it afterwards. Just once or twice if you need to. Which I might choose to, just because we went small dice on the cuts and I don't want the chicken to kind of overwhelm that. You could also have just chosen to small dice this. Poached chicken. I'm going to move back to put it in the broth. And I'm going to simmer this chicken in the broth. Cherry tomatoes. And as those cherry tomatoes begin to soften, I'm going to add now a little bit more liquid. As you can see, it's starting to look almost a little bit more like a stew. We want it to say a soup. Bring this to a simmer. Basil that's torn up, or a chiffonade of parsley, and some Parmesan cheese. If I had one, I could even have been simmering a Parmesan rind, that little edge of Parmesan, a fresh Parmesan rind. Just simmer that in that broth. That'll give another kind of depth of flavor. I'm going to choose to just finish it with a little bit of grated Parmesan. Once I see that simmer and start to see those tomatoes soften a touch, that's when I'll add these ingredients. Season with a little bit of salt and pepper. And finish plating. With any good soup, it's important to cook all the ingredients properly, and so don't forget about the grain that you're going to add. If you're adding something like a noodle, while you could simmer the noodle in the broth and put it all together, eventually that noodle is going to get to the point where it's going to be overcooked and it's going to actually continue to absorb the broth as it cooks. And so I always choose to cook my noodles separate and hold them separate from my soup. You can put it in the bottom of the bowl and ladle the soup over the top of the noodle. And so what we're going to do is the simple boiling method for a grain. And so I have a couple cups of a small pasta shell and a large pot of boiling water. I'm going to season my water with a couple pinches of salt. It's at a nice rolling boil. I'm going to drop my pasta in and then cook until al dente, just undercooked. I want there to be a little bit of a bite. Could even go just shy of al dente because it's going to carry over cook. 7 to 8 minutes, let's say probably 5 to 6 minutes. We're going to strain this from the water, drizzle it with a little bit of oil to make sure that it doesn't stick together, and then set it aside. If I wanted to shock it to stop that cooking process, rather than dropping it into or rinsing it underwater and getting rid of all that starch, I will choose to strain it, put it in a single layer on a sheet tray, and pop it into the freezer if I'm not serving it immediately, just to kind of take the initial heat off of it, chill it down, then take it out of the freezer until I'm ready to use it. My pasta is just al dente. I'm going into my strainer. Drizzle just a little bit of oil. And take it. Single layer on a sheet tray. And I'm going to pop it just into a freezer. We're ready to finish. So our tomatoes will come up to a nice simmer, and they've been simmering with that chicken. The chicken's fully poached. Now we're going to do final seasoning. A little bit of flat leaf parsley. I won't put the whole thing in, but I will put a good amount in. Basil. The basil really does start to wilt, permeate the sauce. A nice pinch of fresh ground black pepper, pinch of salt, another pinch of salt or two. Final seasoning, a couple pinches Parmesan cheese, which will give kind of a creamy quality to that broth. And just a little squeeze of lemon juice, just a touch. Stir it all in, turn off the heat, and we're ready to plate. I do have just some noodles that I have in a small side bowl, rather than pouring all the noodles right directly into this pot. If you were serving this family style and you knew you weren't going to have leftovers, then it would be absolutely fine to put the noodles in the pot, but always good to cook them separate from one another. Come on over here, on the plate. All right. Making sure to get a good amount of all the meaty parts, the veggies, all the good stuff, and then pouring the broth right over the top. And you can kind of just make it so that it's not one big pile. A little bit more broth. Not too much. You don't want it to be overflowing. Just a little bit more of this parsley. Maybe another pinch of that Parmesan. Chicken noodle soup.